Thank you, Ozgen Felek and also Robin for introducing the program. I just graduated in May. I majored in molecular, cellular, and developmental biology. So it's a little different than all of this, but Özgen recommended that I take Ottoman Turkish, and it was like one of the best decisions I've ever made. I had like the incredibly unique opportunity to look through these manuscripts and archives and like explore a part of Turkish history that I had absolutely no experience with at all. So for that, I am eternally grateful. Yeah, so the manuscript that I chose was called Terceme-i fī'l-ḥavāṣṣi'l-müfrede, and that essentially translates to New Translation for Special Terminologies. And just like a quick background on this manuscript, it details various herbal and plant-based remedies that can be used to treat a very wide variety of symptoms. So, and these are some illustrations from the manuscript itself. So this is, okay. So the author of this manuscript was Muhammad bin Ali. And this is the original date of the text and the date of the copy that we have. The dimensions, it's roughly 20.5 centimeters by 14. There are 102 folios in total. And as you can see, there are 3 sections in the manuscript. So the first section is comprised of a series of illustrations and descriptions. So it's an illustration of some sort of plant or herb, and then a description of the plant and how it can be prepared as medicine, and then what ailments it can be used to treat. The second section is a glossary of medical terminology that has been translated to 3 languages, so Turkish, Arabic, and Italian. And the third section is comprised of comparative charts that have various symptoms and treatments listed. So this is also the call number if anyone is at Beinecke and wants to see the book or the manuscript. So this is some background on the text. And some more background. So Muhammad bin Ali, within the text, there's a sort of introductory page, and he describes himself as being interested in medicine from a very early age. And he explains his purpose in writing this book as over here, which I can sort of summarize as him wanting to sort of spread this knowledge of herbal remedies to people who lived in the Ottoman Empire so that they could have access to this knowledge and not be cheated by sort of Europeans who were trying to sell them at higher prices. So he saw himself as doing a sort of like godly service, and that was his sort of motivation for producing this work, but an interesting thing I would like to note is that around the same time or a little earlier, Castore Durante published his own book called Herbario Nuovo, which I will get into a little bit later, but there are a lot of similarities between this text and the one that I read, the Muhammad bin Ali's version. So there are many similarities between the plants, their descriptions, and it is presumed generally that Muhammad bin Ali either collaborated with or had some access to this book and then translated it from Italian to Ottoman Turkish. All right, now back to Muhammad bin Ali's version. So each folio in this section, as I had mentioned, illustrates a plant, and some of it is in color. It describes how to prepare medicine from it. So whether that's a tea or making some kind of ointment. And then next, it describes the symptoms or diseases that the sort of aforementioned remedy can be used to treat. And each plant is categorized by the type of ailments that it can be used to treat. And those categories are either hot, cold, dry, and or moist. So oftentimes each plant is assigned to 2 of these categories. And this is based on the theory of humorism, which was developed by ancient Greek and Roman physicians. And essentially what that is that there are 4 humors or vital bodily fluids, such as blood, yellow bile, phlegm, or black bile. And when those humors are imbalanced, this is what was thought to have caused illness. So the theory was also then adopted by Islamic physicians. And herbs and foods that were associated with a particular humor were thought to be able to counter a symptom associated with the opposite sort of category, if that makes sense. So someone who had a fever and was sweating, that would be considered hot and wet and would therefore be given some sort of substance associated with being cold and dry. Yeah, so another thing I would like to note is that with each entry, so each plant, there is a translation in Arabic, Turkish, and Frangi, which is Italian. And this is alphabetized, but it is alphabetized according to the Italian translations. So if I go next. So this is an example of what some of these illustrations look like. So here we see asparagus, wild asparagus to the right. And you can see the illustration is pretty clear, which was the point, just to make this information more accessible. And in red, I don't know, I think you guys can probably see, but in red on the bottom, it says Frangi, and then it has the word in Italian, Arabic, and Turkish. And the same thing, and just a side note, asparagus, it describes like a few lines underneath as having the ability to unclog the kidneys, which is sort of, I guess, based in some truth, because asparagus has been shown to prevent the formation of kidney stones, and it's a diuretic, so it increases urine output. And then to the left, we have bird's nest fern. So again, it's sort of a similar, you have the translation in the 3 languages in the first line. And this plant has been used to treat, like, I think it's used topically, I believe, for like various different like sort of skin conditions. And if we go next, so these are just some more illustrations in the manuscript that I thought were really beautiful, and they have like tons of color, which I think is pretty cool too, especially if you want this to be accessible to people, just for them to sort of be able to identify these plants so that they can use them for remedies. I think is pretty important. Okay, so this is Herbario Nuovo by Castor Durante. There was actually a copy at the Beinecke, which I was able to get my hands on for a little bit before, unfortunately, we were sent home in March. So I don't have all of the information, but this is what I do have. So it's a pretty large book, as you can see. And this is like the date of the original text in the copy. So it is a little before Muhammad bin Ali's version of Terceme-i came out. So here we can see that it is bound in leather. So the spine is in leather. And this is what the first page looks like. And I would like to say, like, about this is that this text is actually was very important because Durante wanted his book to be used by physicians and herbalists, and he wanted this information to be accessed by many people, because these were remedies that had been passed down. They were like ancient, and he wanted to sort of put them all together and make them readily accessible, which is why, which we'll see like on the next slide, he had very clear illustrations as well. And he also translated them. into a couple languages. It depends on the edition. So between the first, there were 8 versions of this that were published, and the first one was, I believe, in 1585, and the last one was in 1718. And with each version, there are just increasing numbers of plants or herbs that are sort of put into the book, and these are also alphabetized. So if we go, one second. Yes, so sorry, one second. So if we go next, okay. So here on the left, we can see this is a page out of Herbario Nuovo by Castor Durante. And then here we can see a plant called Asaro. So this, if you look a couple lines underneath, it says Nomi. So here you can see that it is also translated into a few languages. And then to the right, we have a page out of Muhammad bin Ali's text. And if you can see, the illustrations are very, very similar, nearly identical. And the descriptions are a little bit more brief on the right. And it's just a more sort of concise summary of what's happening on the left. And essentially, this plant has been used to treat various like lung conditions like bronchitis and asthma, some lung infections, and other chest pains. So this just goes to show that it does seem as though the text on the right is, I don't want to say identical, but nearly identical to the one on the left. And there is also another example of this that I have, which is here with this plant called Betonica. And this is, as you can see, the leaves are pretty much identical. The one pointed difference is that the text on the right does include color. So you can see that the flowers are a little purple, whereas obviously the one on the left is all in black and white. But again, the translations are the same. And this plant is used in teas, and it's often used to treat diarrhea or as a sort of like to gargle for mouth infections. So out of all of these entries, I found one plant that was particularly interesting, and that was St. John's wort, or Hypericum perfortum. So what I did over the course of the semester was I looked through all of these entries, and eventually I found one that I transliterated with Ozgen Hoca and then translated. So if you go through, you can see this is, there are the translations, and then it goes into the category. So this plant specifically is categorized as hot and dry, and then it lists the benefits. So I'll just sort of go through it a little bit. It's thought to benefit wounds when used as topically and strengthen nerves. Also for coughing, dehydration, bloody stools. The way that it was used was that oftentimes it would be steeped to make some kind of syrup or some kind of tea. And it also mentions that it can heal wounds internally, and that it can unblock the female uterus and regulate menstruation. But also at the end, which I thought was pretty interesting, the last sentence of this entry was that a competent physician is necessary to use this plant because it's very, very strong, and that beginners should not use it. So I thought that was pretty interesting.
Fatosh, you have 5 minutes.
Okay. So if we go to the next page, to my next slide, I want to just discuss St. John's wort a little bit more. So it's a flowering plant that is native to Europe, and it produces 2 chemical compounds, hypericins and hyperforins. So historically, this plant has been used to treat wounds and lung ailments, insomnia, and depression. And actually, currently, a lot of people who sort of are into more traditional medicine use St. John's wort as a dietary supplement for depression, as well as other things, including menopausal symptoms and ADHD. I thought the menopausal symptoms thing was pretty interesting because it also, in the last slide over here, it's mentioned that it can unblock the female uterus and sort of regulate menstruation. So it's clear that St. John's wort has been used both historically and in some ways currently to treat sort of various things. But it can also very dangerously interact with a variety of medicines. So this is not to say just to like go loosely, you use St. John's wort. I think take this with a grain of salt. It has seriously shown that it can interact with medicines in like life-threatening ways. But a little more about the chemistry behind this. So hyperisins and hyperforins are light-activated anthraquinones. So this is a light-sensitive compound. So if you do try to buy some type of oil with St. John's wort, usually it'll be in like a brown or dark green bottle to protect it from the sunlight. And also another interesting thing about hyperisins is that they are known to have antiviral and anti-cancer activity. And anthraquinones generally occur in their glycosidic forms, which is on the right hand side, that's an anthraquinone. And they have been used as medicines that exhibit laxative, diuretic, estrogenic, and immunomodulatory effects. Now hyperforins, So hyperforins display antimicrobial activity and are thought to be the primary compound responsible for the antidepressive effects of the plant of St. John's wort. So I was reading this paper, and this group had done this study with hyperforins, and they sort of assessed it in vitro, and they saw that it acted as a reuptake inhibitor of monoamines, which included serotonin, norepinephrine, and dopamine. And essentially what a reuptake inhibitor is that it is a drug that inhibits the reuptake of a neurotransmitter from the synapse to the presynaptic neuron. So this therefore increases the extracellular concentration of the neurotransmitters. So basically what that does is it prevents the uptake of all of those like good hormones so that there are more of them that exist extracellularly. And so by that effect, you would have a higher concentration of serotonin and dopamine extracellularly, which would sort of indicate, which would give some sort of cause as to the antidepressive effects of the plant, if that makes sense. Yeah, so that is a little bit of the chemistry. But before I conclude, I would also like to add that there is actually a transliteration of some version of this text, and it was published in 2006. The authors translated the text, so there are like copies of the version of the manuscript that they have in the back of the book, and they, in the beginning, they transliterated the text from Arabic script to Latin script. But in the introduction, they did mention that they were missing some of the entries, and after some sort of comparisons that Ozgen Hoca and I made, we found that the version that we had at the Beinecke had some of those missing pages. So that is something that we're still interested in looking further into and trying to piece together how many of those pages are actually missing and seeing if we can sort of do something with that going forwards. Yeah, but that's my presentation. Thank you.
Okay, first, I would like to thank everyone for being here and to MELA for hosting this session and to Robin and Ozgen for inviting me. The title of my talk is A Book by Any Other Name, Kitab-ı, Şāhidī, Tuhfe-i, Şāhidī, Luġāt-i Şāhidī. So in the summer of 2007, the Beinecke Library at Yale University exhibited and partially cataloged in their digital collections around 35 new Islamic manuscript acquisitions. Amongst these, a handful were designated as Ottoman Turkish texts. One such text was a rather striking and unique copy of the Kitab-ı Şāhidī, seen cataloged here, and is what we may now call, for now, a Persian Ottoman dictionary, written during the 16th century. This text is also known as the Tuhfe-i Şāhidī or Luġāt-i Şāhidī. What immediately drew my attention was the intriguing metal cover decorated with an embossed design of two cranes in a meadow, which has been folded over and behind the book's leather and paper binding. Opening the book, I was then struck by the painting pasted on the top of the very first page, depicting a man sitting and smoking and surrounded by gold-colored floral decoration. At the beginning then, my interest was largely visual. I was fascinated by who could have drawn this image and where are they from, although there appears to be no information about the artist or artists. However, as I began to read the text itself, I became more interested in the format of the work and its author, İbrahim Şāhidī, who was born in the southwestern Anatolian city of MELA and lived from 1470 to 1550. The Mukaddeme, meaning introduction or prologue, is in Ottoman Turkish and is written with black and red ink. In it, İbrahim Şāhidī tells the reader about himself and his intentions. Gıdayım Şāhidī Mevleviyim, Diyare Menteşe'de Muğleviyim. Bihamdillah ki merde meneviyim, ki gavase bihari mesneviyim. Muradum bu ki tufem bula şöhret, gele evzan ile etfala kudret. İdeler furs ile evzana hasıl, olalar ilmi mevlanaya kabul. Zihi izzet, zihi devlet saadet, anun kim ola bu ilmi liyaket. And it translates as, I am the beggar, I am Şāhidī the Mevlevi. I am from MELA in the province of Menteşe. May God be praised that I am an intellectual man, that I am a diver in the seas of the Mesnevi. It is my wish that my Tuhfe will become famous, that through its meter it will give power to the children, in order that together with Persian they will learn the meters, that they will be skillful in the science of Mevlana. What glory, what prosperity and happiness for him who then becomes fit for this science. And this translation is taken from an article written by Antoinette C. Verberg entitled The Tuhfe-i Şāhidī, a 16th century Persian Ottoman dictionary in rhyme. Thus, already in this presentation so far, some of the ambiguities of the title of the work are evident. Şāhidī refers to the text himself as a tuhfe, or a gift, whereas the metal cover and the first page entitle the work simply a kitab, or book. Its third commonly used title, Luġāt, refers to its format, what is often categorized as a dictionary in verse, in modern Turkish, manzum sözlük, or more accurately, a vocabulary, as it only contains a purposefully limited number of words without any definitions. This term, however, seems to obscure some of the more particular features of the genre, such as its attention to rhyme and meter. Indeed, it would also be accurate to say that it is itself an original poetic composition. There is still much to be studied on the poetic and lexicographic features of this work, but perhaps a couple of examples can give us some insight into it. In the second half of line 236, the pattern that is most commonly used is shown. The words have the same meaning, are side by side, and in this specific one, it is Turkish first and Persian second, but the reverse is also used throughout. So here we have Turkish, Persian, Turkish, Persian, konuk alan Mizban, konua mihman. And I use this example because my last name is Mizbani, that's where it comes from. And in the second example from line 81, you see two words given in one language and then two translations. So here we have Turkish, Turkish, Persian, Persian. Arpa ve burulce, cev ve lubya. And I also want to point out that I'm using Turkish transliteration system because cev is how it would be pronounced in some dialects of Turkish, but in Persian, it's jo, je and vav. There are numerical annotations that help the reader match the Persian and the Turkish words. On occasion, there are two Persian terms given for a single Turkish word. The arrangement of the words seem to be sometimes in thematic order and sometimes not. In the Beinecke copy, the use of red ink seems to be purely decorative and is not preferred for either Turkish or Persian words. It is here that the second main ambiguity becomes evident. In an era which it was produced, when the Ottoman court wrote in Persian and the Safavid court made use of Turkish, texts like the Tuhfe-i Şāhidī could have been used as a pedagogical tool in either direction. Indeed, we find examples of this text in collections around the world, sometimes with commentaries and marginalia in Arabic, testifying to the broader usage of the Tuhfe-i Şāhidī by those competent in other languages. What this has entailed is that, in addition to the 3 commonly used titles for the work, within our contemporary cataloging system, the same title is often transliterated in different ways, reflecting different archival choices as to the original or intended historical user of the text. In the chart I have displayed here, you can see the various ways that universities, museums, and other archival collections have chosen to catalog this work, ranging from the use of the modern Turkish, Arabic, or Persian transliteration. And none of these choices are necessarily incorrect. All are justifiable in one way or another. Yet the multiplicity presents a number of challenges for both the librarian and the researcher. Due to the ubiquity of the work, many libraries have multiple copies, often acquired decades apart. And so far, I have found 7 at Yale, and may vary in their entries. Furthermore, the text is often found bound with other pedagogical tools, such as the 18th century Tuhfe-i in collections called Mejmua. And before going on, I do want to show you some of the most beautiful examples I found in digital collections, since none of us can travel. And this one's found at the Harvard Arts Museum, which has this beautiful marginalia. And the second one is in the University of Michigan Library, which has Sultan Abdulhamid II as its former owner. And you can see just how beautiful it can be. So what I want to suggest here is that this multiplicity is not a shortcoming of any particular library or archive, nor a problem located in the text itself, but rather an example of the strange outcomes that occur when an artifact of the early modern linguistic and pedagogical framework is in place within our modern taxonomic cataloging systems. It is perhaps more beneficial for us to understand that this incompatibility is not a problem to be solved, but rather a revealing moment of interaction between 2 very modes of thought and language. That this form of the Tuhfe-i Şāhidī is an enigma to the modern scholar is evident through Verberg's study and translation of the text. As she argues, there is neither an alphabetical nor conceptual order of the words. Rather, it is the rhyme and meter of the passage that dominates the logic of the words presented. Thus, in her translation of the work, she not only gives the English equivalents to the Persian and Turkish words, but also rearranges them in alphabetical order according to Turkish spelling, and puts them in a table format. As she writes, this format, quote, offers more useful basis for the study of the Ottoman language, end quote. This rearranging of the Tuhfe-i Şāhidī into something more reminiscent of a contemporary dictionary represents the transposition of its content into what scholar Walter N. Hakala, a scholar of similar versified vocabularies in the Indian context, refers to as, quote, a thoroughly modern mode of reference. In fact, Verberg was somewhat preceded in this by a French scholar of the 18th century, Jean-Baptiste Edinson, who translated the Tuhfe-i Şāhidī into French, but kept its pedagogical function by abandoning the verse format and restructuring the text into charts and tables with Persian and Turkish words given alongside their French and Latin equivalents. Another translation made in 1731 by the Capuchin monks in Istanbul, entitled Farhang-i Şāhidī, similarly rearranges the French, Turkish, and Persian words into a list format, but also includes Arabic equivalents on the right. As Hakala argues, quote, the eventual dominance of alphabetical arrangements in various forms of reference, dictionaries as well as encyclopedias, was a consequence of an emerging perception that all forms of knowledge could be reduced to their orthographic elements, and that lexicographic genres like the multilingual vocabulary and verse were subsumed with the totalizing logocentric logic of the comprehensive dictionary, end quote. Thus, in reformulating the text, its oral and poetic qualities were deemed less important than its function as a vocabulary, Whereas the rhyme and meter of the Tuhfe-i Şāhidī encourages recitation aloud, the European translations instead function as more of a reference text, encouraging the search for a specific word. In rearranging the format into something more convenient and digestible in their own discursive context, these three translations abandon the rhyming scheme and meter essential to their original work, and indeed to the pedagogical practices that aided memorization. By contrast, when we look at a 19th century printed edition of the Tuhfe-i Şāhidī from the Ottoman context, we can see that the text has again been superimposed upon a grid. Yet here, its poetic meter, rather than the content, organizes the grid, which, as can be seen, separates single words to highlight individual feet or aruz of the meter. Such a composition served to aid oral recitation rather than vocabulary reference, but it nevertheless also represents a certain sort of formal intervention. When we look at manuscript copies, for instance, we see that the grid forecloses the possibility of the dense palimpsest of notes and marginalia that personalized copies of the text could display. And this is my favorite example. It's just very chaotic. Thus, when cataloging all these versions of this work as dictionary or vocabulary, the historical difference in lexicographic practice in the European and Ottoman context cannot be fully captured. Hakala's work on Persian, Urdu, versified vocabularies points to another difficulty that the modern taxonomic system has with such texts. Noting the historical fluidity between what is considered Persian and what is considered Urdu in the imperial context of Mughal, post-Mughal India, Hakala argues that, quote, the monoglot ideology of nationalism reduces a vast complex of shared cosmographies to a flat orthographic logocentrism, end quote. In essence, by understanding the text as akin to a contemporary English-French dictionary, for instance, we are obscuring the historical capaciousness of language in the early modern Islamic imperial world, in which differences in language were at times more stylistic and aesthetic in nature, rather than linguistic in the way commonly understood today. This was likewise the case for texts in Ottoman language, which could incorporate entire passages in Arabic or Persian, derived vocabulary or grammar without necessarily being understood as less Ottoman in character. Indeed, as Victoria Holbrook has noted, the project of splitting Ottoman into its Turkish, Persian, and Arabic components was a 20th century nationalist notion, and rejected even by the late 19th century figures such as Şemsettin Sami, the composer of an Ottoman encyclopedia entitled Kamus-i Turki and a French Ottoman vocabulary Kamus-i Faransavi. The translation studies scholar Saliha Paker has similarly argued that the Ottoman notion of translation, quote, did not involve 2 or 3 separate cultures serving distinctly as source and target, but a blending of both an independent system of interculture, end quote. In this sense, even the term Persian Ottoman dictionary is somewhat problematic for the Tuhfe-i Şāhidī, for the Persian language itself could be absorbed within the various registers of valid Ottoman expression. Obviously, this represents something radically different from our conception of a polyglot dictionary, which, it should be noted, have themselves been described in no wise historically related to the monolingual dictionaries, which dominate the category in our minds today. And it is this difference that makes the text so difficult to categorize and catalog in archival and discursive systems shaped by the political realities of the monolingual nation state. Thus, in conclusion, what I first found to be frustrating in all these little variances of this book's catalog entries, such as the 3 different names, the possible transliterations, its designated language, and genre, have in fact proven to be fruitful in helping me reframe my approach to this text and revealing otherwise obscured historical processes and differences. Thank you.
That was superb. Thank you so much, Sharon, and thank you very much to our dear Ozgen Hoca and also to Fatoş for your superb presentations. I hope that you will have a chance to look over the chat because there were some great comments. Oops, there were some fantastic comments being made while you guys were speaking, and I think that this was a tremendously successful and rather experimental sort of session for a typical MELA conference. And now I open the floor for a question. Image, Sharon, in the front of your copy of Tuhfe-i Şāhidī, you did explore a little bit about that image. Can you tell us just a bit more about it?
You mean the miniature painting or the metal work?
Yeah, the miniature painting for sure.
Yeah, so the miniature painting, Robin, you and I tried to see if we could figure out if it was part of the book or if it was pasted on. And, you know, given that we didn't have a laboratory, but from what we could see that it was pasted onto the first page, that doesn't necessarily mean it was added later. It pasted on at the same time, but it's interesting to note that it wasn't part of the original paper.
Mm-hmm.
But there's nothing about the artist. There's nothing about where it's from. So it's kind of a mystery to me still.
Yeah. Yeah, it has a very Indian appearance to it, I think, rather than an Ottoman sort of look. Ask Fatoş, because you didn't tell the wonderful story about, would you please come back and tell us that story?
Yes, I can tell you. So like I mentioned, I just graduated in May, and I started working at a lab. I'm studying viruses, which is, interesting. But I'm studying viruses at a lab at the University of Pennsylvania. But while I was interviewing, in the middle of the interview, the professor in charge, so the principal investigator or the PI, like stopped our conversation mid-interview and was like, I have to ask you about this thing that's on your resume. And I was like kind of confused, but then he went on to ask me about the academic symposium. And so I explained it to him, and he was so like, not just like shocked, but like also very interested. And now he like won't leave me alone. And like every time I see him, he's like, you literally have to present like this presentation that I've presented as like twice now. He's saying you literally have to present it at the next lab meeting. And he's like told everyone about it, and he's like super interested in it, and he thinks it's so interesting, and he loves that I was able to sort of put some of my science background to use in like a very historical way. So yeah, it was pretty funny, but now everyone in my lab knows about it. I'm like the Ottoman Turkish like expert, which is very generous because I'm really not. But yeah, I thought it was pretty funny, but it came up during my interview, and it's still brought up almost every day.
I really love this story. I think that, we talk so much about bringing STEM topics and humanities together, and this was like the absolute perfect combination of these things. So yeah, I love this story. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, thank you.
So okay, more questions. We have a little bit of time. Go ahead.
I wanted to ask Ms. Fatoş about her manuscript. I was just wondering whether we have, or you have, all the information about the author, and when or where did he finish his?
So about Muhammad bin Ali. So the information that I have is pretty much just the information that he sort of wrote himself about himself. I mean, I don't have much besides sort of like when the text was written and like his motivation behind writing it. That's really all I have right now at the moment. Yeah, I don't think he was sort of like a self-proclaimed physician or someone who was like really interested in medicine, and that's pretty much all that I do have at this point. That's sort of like about his background.
This is a complete manuscript. There is nothing missing.
At this point, it seems like there's nothing missing. I have compared it with the version that is in the published text, that book that I mentioned at the end that has transliterated a version of this. it seems as though we have all the pages that they have plus some. So it seems like that's what it looks like right now. But some of so that's like the first section of the manuscript. The second and third section, not necessarily the second section, but the third section, which has comparative charts. From what I can remember, because it's been a while since I've seen the manuscript, the charts don't seem complete, or some of them do seem a little washed out. But that's pretty much it. In terms of like the illustrations and everything, it seems as though like most, if not all of it, is there. There is some damage to some of the pages, though, I will say.
Do any of our speakers have any final comments they'd like to offer? Something that you wish you'd said that you didn't quite have time for? Okay. Okie dokie. We are at time, and thank you everyone for your lovely comments in the chat, and thank you to our dear speakers, Ozgen, Sharon, and Fatoş. Really, thank you so much. Thank you first off for being in the class last fall and for basically being sort of guinea pigs for this whole approach, and thank you for agreeing to join us again and present your work to a room full of professional librarians. We are always interested in how to make our collections live and make them, and bring them into teaching in an active way. So you guys really have demonstrated how successful that can be. So many, many thanks. Thanks to you all.
Thank
It is for everybody.